everybody had a good week and weekend. You guys do anything fun or entertaining or more than just entirely pragmatic and boring?
I watched the Commanders lose.
Who are the Commanders?
The Washington football team, Redskins, Commanders, whatever name we're going by now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I spent all of my time on my discovery project because it took a lot longer than I thought it was going to.
Ooh.
Okay, I think the correct way to phrase that is I spent all my time on my discovery project because I'm a real student and I'm dedicated to my education.
That
Yeah,
is
right.
correct. It was very fun though.
Milo,
That's
what did you do?
I did a digital painting basically.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Did you put it on the discussion?
Yes, just like right before
Okay.
I finished the recording of my voiceover right before the class. But I did
Okay,
do that.
Cool.
because I'm trying to get to the discussion. Okay, there it is. All right, because what I wanted to do today is go through the projects that are on the discussion board. I think about half the ones that were turned in are on the discussion. And the discussion is just, it's 5 extra points, and you get those 5 points for posting it. You don't get those 5 points for doing a perfect project. You get them for posting your project, whatever that project is. And so it's an easy 5 points. Everybody should be, pardon me, excuse me. I hope that didn't get on you. But the the reason why I want everybody to post them is so that we can share them. It takes place of sharing them in person in class. And I want everybody to see what other people have done because there have been some really interesting ones. But there's a couple issues that I see cropping up that I wanted to address and talk about, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this first, and then we'll go into Cubism. If that's all right with you guys. Was that too harsh of a transition from pretending to care about your weekend to starting the instruction? Okay.
Not at all.
Because I'm sincere in my pretending to care. I'm really grateful you guys have a sense of humor. Otherwise, I'd be in so much trouble. Okay. Okay, we're going to go to the discussion board right now, and so we can talk about some of these projects. And I would like both of you guys to talk about your projects. So, Milo, excuse me, it looks like this is your project, and then
Yes,
this
it
is the
is.
video that you did for it.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what your project entailed? You said it was digital painting. Could you explain what you
Yes.
were doing and why it's rooted in the 20th century?
So I have a tarot card deck. I don't know if you guys know what tarot cards are. Um,
Yeah, my
but
youngest daughter, well, second to youngest daughter, reads tarot.
yeah, so I have a tarot card deck called Ethereal Visions Tarot Card Deck, and the entire deck is in the Art Nouveau art style. And so when I found that we were going to be learning about that art style, I wanted to recreate one of the cards, but using a character of mine, kind of like redesigning it with a character of mine.
Okay.
And so I redesigned it, and then I also um, I added uh, flowers that were based off of a design that a Art Nouveau artist Eugene Grasset. I can't remember his name, but it's Eugene something. And then I used his the design of his flowers, and I added that to the drawing, and then I did all of that. Yeah, and it took me
Okay. And then,
for
I'm sorry.
and it took me forever.
Well, evidently not because you're done with it. If it really did take forever, you'd still be working on it, right?
yeah, it was about a week of work.
This turned out really nice. Now, I see several aspects that tie this directly into Art Nouveau. Could you explain, and I'm sure that you have it in the video here, but could you explain what particular things that you were using as hallmarks for Art Nouveau that you put into this?
Yeah, so a lot of the aspects that I really paid attention to was kind of an asymmetrical balance, um, not only with the background, but also with the posing of the figure. Um, I also incorporated a lot of symbolism into the piece. The tarot card and the flowers that I used all have specific symbolism that relate to his character. And Art Nouveau like to focus on a lot of symbolism, especially like symbolic figures in the art. Um, they're also very much known for like very flowing lines and a lot of details with like florals and botanical drawings. And so that's why I kind of added those flowers, because I wanted to emphasize that aspect of the Art Nouveau art.
Yeah, Art Nouveau was a direct consequence and reaction to the industrialization that kind of hallmarked that transition between the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's one of the reasons why you see the plants, you see these kind of flowing organic lines. And that's why this font here is really good for Art Nouveau, because this is the very kind of thing. I mean, you talk about um, asymmetrical balance, or informal balance. You talk about plant symbolism and things like that. That's really good. They try to bring a lot of that in. So nicely done. And I like how you're able to articulate what you've done, explain why you made the choices. I think this is a really good example of the kind of thing we're looking for, uh, because it directly relates to the class, but you're also demonstrating your facility with those tools of artistic critique and your ability to articulate what you see and then bring it forward to something else that you're doing. Now, I think I want to talk a little bit about, so I think this is really good, but why specifically, Milo, does this tie into 20th century art? And
So that art,
sorry?
I was just saying that art style started on the tail end of the 19th and into the 20th century. So it was just kind of that it bridged um, like the end and the beginning of those two centuries.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's an excellent answer, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. There are a couple things I wanted to talk about, and I think that this looks like a really good project because it has everything that we wanted to see, relating to the class. Um, a couple of things that I'm noticing is every once in a while somebody will do a project that is a really good idea, but it does not fit squarely into the parameters of the class, which is like, for example, this class, it doesn't fit into 20th century art. And there's ways to fiddle with that. For example, if you're doing a historic survey on something that was also made in the 20th century, and we could say something like chess sets, for example, they've been made. If you One of the forerunners of chess was Snefetafel, which was a Viking board game, and that is at least 400 years older than the chess that we're familiar with. But you could do a project where you go through and look at all those kinds of things, but focus on chess sets, particularly what people did with them in the 20th century. And your introduction would be, I'm really fascinated with what we now consider to be retro style chess sets of the 20th century. And I wanted to learn a little bit about the history of them. And that tie-in is what's really necessary. I think somebody did a project where they did a really good job researching the history of an item, but they didn't spend very much time focusing on that item being produced in the 20th century, or what kinds of things are going on with the 20th century. And regardless of how much time you spend on your project focusing on that 20th century part, it is really important in the introduction to say, this is why I'm interested in this. This is why it relates specifically to the 20th century. And this is why it relates specifically to 20th century art. And for something like an Art Nouveau thing, that is one of the art movements that we talk about be specific to the late 19th century and early 20th century. You know, if you're doing a survey of portraiture or whatever, I wouldn't do 19th and 20th century portraiture. I would do 20th century portraiture. And if you wanted to do a comparison, you would focus on the 20th century and say, I'm also comparing so-and-so because these other artists in the 20th century took their work and expanded it. Does that explanation make sense? What I was talking about? Okay. And this may be as easy as a while ago, there was a student who their project said, hey, I made a sandwich with olive oil, and here's a picture of it. And I thought, so I actually ended up talking to the young person and said, okay, this was for a class where we were talking about ancient art before 1350. And I said, okay, so what you need to do then to make this count is share the documentation of making the sandwich, of course. But before you do that, introduce it as, why am I doing this? You know, how is this related to the class? And you know, how can I prove that it's related to an art class? Why is olive oil important? And then talk about the process, the decision-making process. This is how I made the sandwich. This is why I chose to do these things. And it ended up, went away, came back a week later, and his project was, it started off with pictures of amphora in both Greek paintings, Greek like murals and or mosaics, as well as clay work that was found in ships, amphora that were filled with olive oil. Saying, you know, this was important to the ancient Greeks at this time. This is why olive oil was so important. And I thought, what do we use olive oil for today? And even found an image of somebody eating something that looked like it could be a sandwich. I mean, I don't know what it was, but it looked like it. And then he shared all the photos that he had taken during the process of making the sandwich, talking about why he used specific ingredients and stuff like that. And then it ended up being a perfect project. And it was just a sandwich, but he was able to tie it squarely into the art of the periods that were covered within that class of scope. So, and that's something. Another thing that I'm noticing is that some people are, you know, we talk specifically about citations, and I'm noticing a problem with videos too. There's been a couple of videos that were turned in that I was not able to access, and I just asked the person, you know, if that's the case, please send me a YouTube link, you know, and if they do that, then that's fine. We can still watch it, and then they can post the YouTube link on the discussion board. And so I prefer to have the file sent to me directly, but something is going on with my system, and it will not allow me to read video files directly unless I go through a really long process to extract them. So I'm going to have to figure out what's going on with my antivirus stuff. But if that's the case and I can't watch your video, please, if it's really, I can even walk you through setting up a YouTube channel, but please post it and then send us the link and put the link in the discussion, because then we can still access it. Something else that I've noticed is that, okay, Kelly and I had this discussion last week, and she was a perfect example of how to do it correctly. Where, yeah, go ahead, do your little prance there. But but the citations are really important to get correct. For art and humanities, typically we do MLA style citations. And I've included 10 different free websites that you can plug in and a URL, and it will deliver to you a MLA style citation. And double check them because they're not always, I mean, 98% of the time they're pretty good, but every once in a while it's kind of screwy. Like if there are multiple authors, it doesn't know how to handle that sometimes. And you just, but it's important that you don't just send the URLs or the links. That doesn't count. Doesn't give you any credit at all. But if you, but when you get your information, get the citations in MLA format, and then alphabetize them. And you alphabetize by putting numbers first and then letters, and you use just the English alphabet. And this is true even if you're doing annotated bibliography. You have your 2 paragraphs of annotations for each of the citations that you're using. When you alphabetize it, it may not be in the order you want to present the material, but that's fine. For the purposes of this class, that's fine. Okay, because it's important that you get it in alphabetical order. So and that's true of all the citations. And then one thing that we've talked about every week since the beginning of the semester is the accessed on phrase at the end of your citation. Your citation does not need to have the URL in it, just all the rest of the information. You do not need to have the URL. And at the end of it, you put a period, and then you write accessed on and the date, period. Whatever format you use for the date, you can use numbers. You can say, August 3rd, 2017, or whatever it is. You wouldn't for this class, of course, because none of you are cheaters and you'd only be doing stuff for this class within the time scope of this class. But whatever calendar format you use, make it consistent through with all of your accessed on date phrases. And the reason why, and we talked about why we have to have those. Do either of you guys want to answer the question as to why we have to have the accessed on phrase? Remember I was talking about Richard Hoagland last week and NASA?
I don't remember NASA, but date of access, just kind of the relevance of the material. That material changes, it evolves, and
Yeah, websites transform. And if the person putting up the website can't afford to maintain the website address, sometimes that'll be lost. But if you have the accessed on date, you can go to one of the archiving websites and it will show you exactly what that looked like at the day that it was accessed originally. And that's why it's so important. This was not a concern before the internet allowed you to do a lot of research, because the assumption was you found the physical thing. But so that's why the accessed on date is so important.
I
So
found
if
it
you,
interesting because I had to cite a tarot deck, and that was interesting to try to figure out how to correctly cite that. And so I kind of just did the accessed on date as like the date that I pulled out the card to take a picture of it. And I hope that that was good, but it was just interesting because it's a personal deck that I own. I didn't like access it from anywhere, but it was, I don't know, I had to figure that out.
I think that's a really good resolution for that. That's excellent. Because if you are doing an MLA citation for a personal interview, then it would be the date of the interview. So I think what you did is perfectly fine, because essentially it's the same kind of thing. And there are citations for artworks, and that's something, I would look up standard MLA citation for an artwork, and that's what I would reference for something like a tarot deck. But I think what you did is most likely going to be just fine. What sometimes can be problematic is when people just throw up their hands in despair and not even try. if you try and get half the points, at least you got half the points, and then now you know how to get the other half. So, that's really good. Yeah, there were a couple projects that I couldn't access or didn't seem, or I didn't understand what the student was doing. And so I didn't give them very many points, but I also wrote an explanation as to why it needed to be changed. Now, I did want to, let's see, hold on just a second. Okay, I want to share this. This is Kelly's project, and I want to show you what was done here. So this is an image, and this project is all about creating something that was Fava/expressionist style painting. And then we can see, let's see, right, get over here. We have images like this, and this is the kind of thing that I really appreciate, where we have at least 4 different images of the process that was going on. And Kelly even diagrammed out what are the hallmarks of expressionism that were found that this intentionally followed. And then we get a little bit further on, and then we can see the final painting. And what is fun about this one is Kelly walks us through what expressionism was, what Fauvism was, what are the visual hallmarks for each of those movements, and then why she made the decisions that she did about her own painting, and what made it, what were the relations between her painting and those two movements. So I thought that was a really well done project as well. And this is on your guys' discussion board, so double check that. And then I wanted to get to this part right here, and this is what I'm talking about.
Sorry.
We look at these, the works cited, all of them have the accessed on date at the end, and all of them look like they follow the MLA format. It's really tight together, and this is one of the reasons why I say it's not necessary to put the URL in, because it just crowds it up. But yeah. I think this turned out really well because it's alphabetized and everything. So this is a good example. So I'm glad both of you showed up, because I think both of you did really good projects to use as examples for the class.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the drawing, the digital drawing. Did you go through each layer for that?
Yeah, so the process is kind of in there, but I started with like a rough sketch, and then I outlined it, and then I did like all of the coloring, and just I did like a base color layer, and then I added more layers onto that to like build it up. I tried to make it similar to how I would approach watercolor, but it was on my tablet, so.
It's lovely. It's a medium that, I mean, I know I look like a college kid, but I'm a little older, so digital painting isn't exactly part of my repertoire. So to bring in that watercolor effect, which Nouveau, had, is lovely. It's really great.
There's been some really interesting things. Like last semester, there were a couple people that were really intensely into video games and online gaming, and 2 people would rebuild historic architecture using Minecraft. And if you can imagine the Cologne Cathedral or the Sacred Family Cathedral in Spain in Minecraft blocks, I mean, these things were astounding.
That's awesome.
One of them, they spent twice the time, they spent about they spent over 20 hours putting together, reconstructing the architecture with Minecraft. And then another guy is really fast. There's three games that he played, and I don't know. When you're this intense, play is not the right word. Inhabited, I think, is probably closer. There's three games that he inhabited, and he dissected how the designers of the games, what are the cultures that they used and drew from to inform character and set design for different aspects of the game, and why were they doing that. And so it was really fascinating him talking about that, going into even the use of the color symbolism that was appropriate to that culture that they appropriated it from. And that was really fun to see. So some people have done some really amazing things. One person also did the history of the pizza for the ancient history, or for the ancient art class. They found imagery of flat cakes in Egypt, as well as Etruscan, Greek, and Roman. And so they did recipes from each of those cultures for the kind of flatbread that they most likely had.
That's
And
awesome.
that was pretty cool. So there's been some really, really solid projects. Like I said, the one guy who did the sandwich, as soon as he understood what the project actually entailed, he went back, and it was a total, A+ effort when he was all done. So really nice. Did you folks have any questions, or do you have any thoughts as to what other students might have questions about regarding these projects, or does it seem like it's pretty consistent? Or do you understand what's going on?
I think it took me a second to figure voiceover on, I use Canva. I'm addicted to it. So, but Canva is pretty simple. I just, hit record and it did it. So I was like, okay, great.
Yeah, it worked out. I have had people that used different programs before that were not compatible with my system, and they had to just record it as a WAV file, and then it was okay. But yeah, there are several different ways of recording the voiceover. If you do a PowerPoint, it needs to be presented as a video instead of as a PowerPoint, because that's the parameter layout for the assignment. And if Teams doesn't work for you, if Canvas isn't working for you, print out the pages. And I actually have had a student do this because nothing was working technologically. He ended up printing out the pages on a color printer, set them up on an easel, put his phone on a mini tripod in front of it, and recorded himself talking about it as he moved the pages. And that worked. I mean, it does it. I mean, the guy got extra credit just because he was not going to give up. So I think it worked out really well. All right. Now, and I am caught up on grading for everything except for last week's reflection. I've graded a few of those, but not all of them. I'm trying to stay with it so everybody knows exactly where they stand every week. And sometimes if there's a lot of people that do a really crappy job, I really hesitate to grade it because I don't want to disappoint people. So if you turn something in and I don't grade it for a month, it sucks. I'm just saying that. So, bless your heart. I'm sure your parents love you.
Can I ask you a really random question? I'm at home and I'm letting my dogs out because dogs. Do you want me to turn off my camera when I'm walking back and forth? I know it's a weird thing, but etiquette wise, like
I
I
don't
just
know.
don't want to.
I think if you're eating like spaghetti with your hands, maybe turn the camera off. But I think everything else would probably be fine.
Cool.
If you want to, go ahead and turn it off. But Milo and I don't care.
Okay. They're just, dogs.
Yeah.
They run the house. Sorry.
Yeah, they're going to be fine. My dogs are in the other room. You guys cannot hear them because there's an automatic sound dampener, and they are butt heads.
Wow.
But they're sweet butt heads, but they are butt heads just the same.
I understand.
Yeah, the only time they want to make noise is when I'm talking to somebody.
I'm serious. I only when I'm on a call, like when I'm on a thing like this. Mm.
Well, if you guys don't have any more questions, excuse me, I wanted to go into what we're going to be talking about for this week's module. Now, the last couple weeks, I am really sorry we crammed a lot of stuff into your head all at once, like, you know, through a trepanation hole. But you know what trepanation is? It's when somebody uses a drill to drill a hole in your skull. And so, and that's, I don't know how it felt to you guys, but it felt like to me that I was feeding you guys a lot of information very quickly. And that's kind of what we had to do, because there needs to be some sort of a setup for the 20th century. Now, we talked about the first movements really in the Western world in the 20th century. We have Art Nouveau, Art Deco. Art Deco is a little bit later, but we definitely have Art Nouveau and arts and crafts. We have a little bit of Impressionism is bleeding into it, not very much. That goes into the Fauvism, and that goes up to about 1905, something like that. And then Fauvism or Impressionism leading to Fauvism, that leads to Expressionism. And so those are the things that really, I think that the fact that anybody was able to sell those kinds of paintings at all, and that in some places they were really popular, really allowed artists to give themselves permission to explore ways of both educating the audience and sharing what they thought or what they felt about the world themselves. Because before then, you do get artists putting their own thing into it. Look back in the Renaissance, even though it was very heavily bent towards realism, you know, kind of a shared realism, shared visual vocabulary, there were artists like Da Vinci who would put a lot of stuff into his paintings that were things that he felt important about himself, but other people didn't necessarily pick up on because they didn't share his worldview. And Madonna and the Rocks is a really good one. And a lot of people have dissected his stuff ad nauseum. There are different things like uh, placing the Last Supper into the Middle East somewhere by using Persian rug designs on the wall coverings for the Sacrament of the Last Supper painting. You know, there were a lot of things like that that people did that most people are not going to even pick up on. And so you do see a little bit of that, but as we get into the 19th century, that's when artists start kind of feeling their way out with their audience, wondering how much they can share of their own personal worldview and still have their art be sellable. Because that is a very real thing that we're dealing with. When even if you have patrons that will pay for your work, it still needs to be palatable to your audience. And when you don't have patrons anymore and you're trying to make work to market, you know, so people are going to actually pay for it, you have to really be paying attention to what your audience will like, for one thing, but also what they can stomach, what they can take. And I think that the Impressionists, one of the big things that they did, a lot of experimentation, a lot of working with ideas of, you know, how far can we push an audience? How much of ourselves can we show? Uh, can we open up our audience minds a little bit so they can expect other things, different things? And by the time we get to the Expressionists, I think that is, well, even before that, I think the Fauvists are probably a good hallmark for that. This is when people start separating highbrow and lowbrow art in their minds and assuming that there is a cultural disparity. And this is where you get people say, well, it's not art unless I can tell what it is. And other people say, well, the beauty of art is that nobody can understand it, you know, and people getting disenchanted. And artists are not, in general, unless it's part of the message that they're trying to share, artists generally are not out there to confuse you. They're using art as a medium of communication. And as an audience, we have a role to play, just as you know, live theater is very different for the actor than playing the video, because they can feed off the audience, and there is this two-way communication going on, even though the actor is doing most of the communicating, apparently, or that's what it seems like. And artists are the same way. If somebody painting or building or sculpting doesn't get feedback, it's really hard for them to know, you know, is this a message that anybody's receiving? And what is kind of frustrating to me is this underlying assumption that most of us have, that if we can understand it, it's we dismiss it as real art. You know, then it becomes folk art. Or if we don't understand it, then it must be highbrow. You know, we feel uncomfortable about going to a museum because it's only for smart people. And there are people that are just obnoxiously um, snooty about, you know, pretentious about artwork, and there's absolutely no reason for that, because artists create something in order for us to enjoy it, and our process of enjoying feeds the artist and encourages them to continue. So if you look at how much the expectations of expression changed between um, 1810 and 1910, it's astounding, because in 1810 you're still doing, artists are still doing stuff that are very recognizable as belonging to the shared world. And by 1910, that's when, you know, people are talking about these artists as wild beasts. Their artists are exploring ways of sharing emotion through color, you know, all this kind of stuff. But what that created is an audience that is kind of expecting this communication with the artist. You know, they're participating in this ongoing uh, structured learning that's both ways. And this is where I think Cubism comes in. As we look at that, and you know, it's called Cubism because John French Sloan was a cartoonist who he just heard, a critic had seen one of the very first Cubist gallery shows, and he said, "Oh, it just looks like there's a bunch of cubes," and that's where they got the name. And so he, you know, he did this whole cartoon. He actually did a series of cartoons. It looks like an exploding Rubik's cube, but yeah, it does look very much like some of, you know, a cursory glance of Cubism. But I think we need to understand what's going on in the minds of the people and in the world, that it was Louis Bossuet who said that Cubism is a reduction of form to simple geometry and cubes, and that's where it got its name from. But what these early artists were doing, and the three principal fairy godfathers or fairy godmothers of Cubism were Braque, Picasso, and Marcel Duchamp. And what is fascinating to me is that a lot of people just don't understand is that they really expected us as an audience to be smart, and they expected us to be participants, active participants in the process of enjoying their painting. So they did stuff that they thought was interesting, that they expected us to find out about and be involved in. You know, it wasn't just let's produce something that nobody understands so that they think it's value. It has value. But these are some of the things that went into developing the worldview that created Cubism. Yeah, you guys can see this, and it says right there where it's from. But do you recognize these kinds of things? One of the, as Europe was colonizing Africa, there's 56 countries in Africa. I would just about slap somebody the other day when they said, yeah, how many colors are in the flag of Africa? So, I don't know. There isn't one. I just, really, really disappointing. But, apparently Africa is a small island nation with absolutely no hope for economic development. But through colonization, the gauges of trains are different. Each country has its own gauge of trains, so you can't even move cargo from Nigeria to Ethiopia because every country you pass through, the colonizing powers made it different, made it separate. And it makes it very hard for people still today to take their rightful place on the world stage. But a lot of that is changing, thankfully. But at this time, 120 years ago, the stuff that people knew about Africa was basically the transportable art that was brought back with them, and a lot of them are culturally specific. There were several groups of people that actually did create stuff specifically for the European market because the artists in these different countries in Africa knew exactly what sold, and so they were building to market. But a lot of these things were historically accurate. And when a young Pablo Picasso was going on his daily strolls, he went to the Ethnography Museum in Paris, and he saw all these amazing masks. And when he saw them, you can recognize human features. We can, even though it's distorted, we can recognize the human features. We can see these are analogous to eyes. This is analogous to a nose. This is analogous to a mouth. This shape is like a triangle pointing downward, but we still feel the relationship it has to human form. This is another triangle one. Here's an oval one. And then you have a structure like this, and it's easy to say, well, all these are very abstracted human faces. Maybe this is very abstracted too. So you can start seeing features in these other structures as well. And I think that really opened up a door where Pablo Picasso was able to give himself permission to start abstracting the human face and sharing it as a grouping of geometric shapes. And what's fascinating is a couple of years ago, there was an exhibit in, I believe it was, I want to say South Africa, but I'm not entirely sure. I think it was a South African museum where they had the original mask and the painting that looks like that mask directly inspired Pablo Picasso's work. And there were two interviews that Pablo Picasso gave where he said, I have no idea what you're talking about when they asked about it. But later on in life, he said, oh yeah, absolutely. This impacted my work. But this happened because up until the Industrial Revolution, it would take months to travel around the world. And you were risking your own life. You would take your own family because otherwise you might not ever see them again. And through the Renaissance or Age of Exploration into the Industrial Revolution, by the mid-19th century, you could get all the way around the world in just a few months, and it was ridiculously fast. And by the 20th century, the dawn of the 20th century, people were communicating pretty much all around the world very, very quickly. You could send a telegram across the Atlantic, which was just astounding to do that. And seeing those masks in Paris is indicative of the incredible growth of communication and transportation technology that the 20th century kind of was born into. Here's a couple really good videos that I want you guys to look at. The Nut Culture did some absolutely astounding stuff. A lot of these are Yoruba. There were several different kingdoms of Yoruba. It basically Western Africa centered around Nigeria, but a lot of incredibly awesome stuff. So watch those when you can. But so these are fascinating because artists are realizing there is a visual vocabulary that we've never addressed before, but it also represents these technological miracles. They're just astounding. I mean, absolutely astounding, of in almost instant communication. And this is where I think we start to see art movements really taking on an intelligent gravitas, where people were communicating with each other as a group, like the Cubists all got together and spoke to each other. The Dadaists later on all spoke to Bauhaus. All these different groups were talking to each other and almost giving assignments to each other, saying, okay, well, so-and-so is kind of an idiot. I'm going to do a piece just making fun of them. Okay, well, this kind of thing is going on over here, so I'm going to do some pieces over here. And they were really using the art movements as a way to consciously express a shift in worldview, or a direct, or an assessment of worldview, or a critique of worldview. And it was exciting to me because it shows that they were really consciously working together to think about it. But then, so that's one aspect of Cubism. But then another one is talking about phenomenology. Are you folks familiar with what phenomenology is at all?
I wrote
Okay.
to you that it broke me.
Well, I want to watch this video, and I'm pretty sure it'll be okay. Let's see. Let me see how long it is. Okay. Yeah, it's only 3 minutes long. We'll talk about it after we watch it. But this is a radical change in philosophy, that, philosophers are a bunch of weirdos that sit in a cave. But with all this communication technology and transportation technology, these kinds of ideas were exciting to people because they were actually being talked about. Like today, if you overhear anybody at like a Starbucks, people are going to be talking about their vapid social media crap, and it's useless. At this time, people in Starbucks, the cafes were Starbucks, basically the same thing. They were talking about stuff that really impacted them personally. How can we look at the world, and what do we need to do to make it better, to make it be the place that we want to live in? And that's where phenomenology came along and really started shifting people's thinking, but it played an active role in these conversations like the Cubists were having with each other. And it was something that people were aware of in the communities where artists sold their work. So let's go ahead and watch this. There might be some big words. Try not to be frightened by them.
Welcome to an explainer on phenomenology. At its most basic, phenomenology is the study of lived experience. As its name suggests, phenomenology is concerned with the study of phenomena that arise from the experience of being in the world. The development of modern phenomenology, established by Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century, was a break from the Cartesian system that pitched stark distinctions between the outer, real reality and the individual experience of reality. Following the Cartesian principle, outer reality is a separate and distinct entity that can only be understood in rational terms through cognitive processes of deduction. Sense perception was thought to distort this process, and certainly emotions were considered a lower form of experience.
Okay, so Descartes is talking about reality as something that is difficult to talk about, because when we start talking about it, we start emoting, and that removes us from what reality is. And this is the kind of thinking that leads to the dispassionate academic professor. Okay, that kind of thing. The smarter you are, the more aware of reality you are, the less connected to your emotions you are. That's where this kind of thinking leads to.
Emanating from the recesses of the body. In contrast, phenomenology seeks to understand the outside world as it is interpreted by and through human consciousness. Ontologically speaking, that means speaking in terms of how philosophers understand the nature of being and existence, Husserl purported that reality could be grasped by and through structures of consciousness. by applying what he called intentionality to the object of study, or intentionally directing one's focus to describe realities. For Husserl, to achieve deeper understanding of an object of study, a researcher could quarantine their personal judgments, a process called bracketing, so that preconceived notions do not interfere with the phenomenological inquiry. It is at this point that Martin Heidegger's approach breaks with Husserl's process. In fact, Heidegger was very critical of Husserl's phenomenology, where Husserl sought to capture objects of study as graspable entities that could be objectively studied. Heidegger employed the notion of Dasein, the situated meaning of a human in the world. For Heidegger, consciousness is a product or construction of the historical context from which it arises, and in turn, one can never approach an object of study in a presuppositionless form. That is, objects of study cannot be neatly separated from their contexts, nor should they be. Reality and consciousness are co-creations, and because of this, human understanding always arises from the relationship between the two acting upon each other. Thank you for watching.
Okay, I am absolutely certain that for many of us that is less than entirely helpful. But what we're talking about, so Descartes is talking about, he essentially is making these assumptions that the more that you live within the world, the more that you react to things, the more you have emotions, the less connected you are to reality. And so it creates a bridge between the intelligentsia and ordinary folks, because the assumption is if you have emotions, if you connect with your family, then you obviously don't understand reality. And what both Husserl and Heidegger are talking about is reality is very much a product of how we live. And I'll give you a couple examples. Have you ever been in an apartment where somebody else decided to move the furniture and didn't tell you, and you get home late at night and the lights are off? Have you ever had that experience where you're walking and you stop because you know that the couch is there even though it's not anymore? Or you're totally surprised because somebody put a chair in your way? We build, and the reason why that happens is because our consciousness has built an understanding of the world around us. So we will react to the couch that's moved as if it's still there until we realize that it's not. And this can explain a lot of things, like if I'll tell you experience. I grew up in southeastern Washington, and there is a particular bridge that makes me very uncomfortable driving on. And I didn't understand why until it dawned on me when I was a kid growing up around there. There used to be houses on either side. And now not only are those houses completely gone, but everything is totally overgrown as if those houses never were there. And so even though I recognize this bridge and it's the bridge and I know it's the bridge, all the environment around it is completely different from what I remembered so thoroughly that my body is still reacting to it even though it's not there anymore. Have you guys ever had experiences like that? Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's one example. Another is, in our culture, if you turn on a light switch, what do you expect to have happen? Yeah, the light goes on. You expect that to happen. Now, during the Age of Enlightenment, the idea started being generated, and this feeds into the philosophies like Descartes and other of that ilk, that all the world is a spectrum of evolution where you have the lowest end and you have the highest end. The lowest end, it happens to be the people without all the doodads and tight-fitting clothing and weird stuff that Europeans have, and the high end happens to be all the stuff that Europeans have. And that basis for understanding has informed everything from the Dewey Decimal System to how we catalog and how we catalog books to today, what we assume about people's education levels by the clothing that they wear. That's what that informs. It's this hierarchical process of understanding. What Heidegger talks about is that if we are indispensable from the reality that we experience and that we are making the reality as we experience it, then one person's experience cannot be more important or more valid than another person's experience. Suddenly, that puts a nail into the coffin of the colonialist mindset. Do you see that? Because colonizers historically will go into a place that they want they want the resources of, and generate as quickly as they can a new worldview for the colonized people that embraces the idea that the colonizers are the most important part of their world. And so they generate a very Cartesian style hierarchy of validity. If I'm using words that are confusing, I hope you understand what I'm getting to. This is one of the reasons why when European colonizers came into the Americas and into the continent of Africa, instead of addressing these heads of state of nations and empires as equals, like they did with all the other countries in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East, they wanted the resources, they wanted the people to believe that they were more valid. And so they relegated them to tribes and chiefs instead of nations and emperors. You know, in the North America alone, there were at least 470 separate nations. And they had everything from matriarchal presidencies, which is actually really cool, where the women get together and vote on who the leader is going to be. Can you imagine whatever problems you had, as soon as you got home, they would be resolved because if you wanted somebody to talk to you in the home, you would make sure that it was resolved. But to parliaments, uh, emperors that were governing huge areas, and but they were relegated to, they were all tribes and chiefs. Same thing happened in Africa. You get cultures that had very different worldviews, but anything that wasn't analogous with the very distorted European sense of Christianity had to be anti-Christian. And in order to ensure that their worldview put the colonizers at the top, they had to change those kinds of world perspectives. And phenomenology is one of the things that really disproves that. Because if reality is not something that somebody else has said, this is what reality is, and you have to relate to it, but instead, like the phenomenologists are saying, reality is actually created as a co-creation between you as an individual and the world around you, then everybody's voice has equal weight. And that is frightening. If you're making money on telling people that they're dumber than you are, that's a terrifying thing. And so that's something else that was the talk of the town, literally in Paris. Everybody was talking about it, and this is something that the Cubists were also dealing with, this kind of idea. No, I got rid of the page I was wanting to go to. Give me just a second here. So we have African masks demonstrating that there's a new way of looking at things. We have communication and transport technology, and we have a new way of looking at the universe that is just astounding. And then another thing that I want to bring into this that you'll see, well, there's two other things, and I want you to watch the videos that are part of this module, and you'll get a better understanding of it. But one is, we're talking about an incredible growth of technologies. between about 1890 and 1920, there was a huge explosion of technologies, and everybody was wanting to be an inventor. You know, that was a cool thing to do. Everybody wanted to be involved in industry. And so you get this idea. If I say, you know, blueprints or blueprint drawings, you get this idea in your head very quickly of an image where you can see multiple sides of the same object all at the same time. You know, this is where we get the isometric view. So you get, I had a drafting class in high school shortly after the Earth's crust started cooling, where you know, you solve these problems so you could see the bottom view, the top view, and the side view, you know, and different things like that. And this is something else that the Cubists were taking into account, this idea of multiple viewpoints, which is also very dangerous. You know, if your validity depends on other people thinking the way you want them to, it is dangerous to validate multiple perspectives, because these African masks represent a group of people, you know, 1,000 miles away, that view the world very differently than you do, but their view is every bit as valid as yours is. And it is, what is really sad is, instead of making the world a richer place for a lot of people, that becomes threatening for a lot of people. And it shouldn't be. If somebody else thinks differently than you, that doesn't change your own perspective at all. I mean, it doesn't change the validity of your perspective at all. It can hopefully enrich it. But anyway, and then another thing is, this is also when people start writing about physics and stuff in newspapers, and which, you know, we look at now. We have a lot of different social media stuff that talks about science. Like you guys know how cold it is on Mars. You guys know how big Saturn is. You know Pluto is no longer a planet, which that still breaks my heart. It's just so sad. I think anything with 5 moons should still be a planet, but evidently that doesn't count. And but people are starting to get these ideas that time may not be what everybody thinks it is. You know, maybe there's something different going on. And and that is more a metaphor for a burgeoning understanding of the physical world. You know, ideas like atoms and electrons, and the vast distances between stars. This starts emerging into the public consciousness at this time. You know, just this expanding awareness that the universe is much different than what people expected. And if you can imagine, all this is happening in the span of 15 years, very, very quickly. And so I wanted to introduce what Cubism is. And as we look through this, just keep in the back of your head these kinds of things that I've spoken about. I want to share with you a short video. Watch all these videos, but I want to share with you one video that is an introduction to Cubism. And then I want to look at some of the artwork that people did. Let's see, let me get to here really quick. Okay. All right. What we're going to do is, I do want you to watch these videos, but this one is just a few minutes long, and I think it'll be really good to watch.
Let's talk about Cubism, one of the most difficult to define art movements, but we're going to try anyway. Now, Cubism was one of the most influential visual art styles of the early 20th century. It's going to be created by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in Paris between about 1907 and 1914. Now, the French art critic Louis Vauxhall, who has turned up in the past, will coin the term Cubism after seeing the landscapes Braque had painted in 1908 in emulation of Cézanne. Vauxhall will call the geometric forms in highly abstracted works cubes. This is, of course, a misunderstanding, because what Cubism does is it strips all of the elements off of something and rearranges them so we can better identify. And one of the best examples would be something like, well, for example, your iPhone. After all, your iPhone has elements on it on both sides that are important to identifying the form, the screen on the front, maybe the home button, depending what version you have, the Apple logo and camera on the back. But of course, I can't show both sides at once, can I? Not if I want to depict it only once. So what the cubists will do is they take those individual elements, they study them individually, and then move them. So maybe the Apple logo and the camera move to the front along with the screen. And we see this in these images. Now, these are self-portraits by Picasso throughout his life. And what you see is on the left, a fairly straightforward self-portrait, something we would recognize. It's all based on proportions and relationships. The relationship between the eyes and between the eyes and the nose and the mouth and all of that. If you've studied art, you're familiar with breaking down the form into these various lines so you know where things sit. But by the time he gets to his cubist form in the middle, you'll notice, for example, that the eyes are not equal. That's because Picasso is studying one eye and then the other, completely independent of one another. And their placement on the face is not in relation to anything else on the face. So they can actually turn up elsewhere, as we see in his very late work. They don't even have to turn up in the same direction that you would commonly expect. The nose here has gotten much larger. He sees it as very prominent, and you'll see it's simplified once again, primarily seen in profile because, of course, that's the most recognizable form. Whereas over here, it's actually done from below, and you're looking at the nostrils. The mouth, again, has no relation to the rest of the face other than it sits fairly low. And we see the same thing over here where the mouth has actually been turned. The line of the jaw is most interesting from the side. So he kind of distorts it and moves it over. Whereas here he's focusing on the line of the cheek and the jaw is completely irrelevant. Whereas typically you would have that line of the cheek and line of the jaw depicted on both sides. So what they're doing is they're taking these individual characteristics, the characteristics that are most identifiable to whatever the form is, and they're moving them around as necessary to give us a better impression of what we're looking at. This is an experiment. How do people look at things? How do people characterize and identify things? Now, other influences on early Cubism have been linked to primitivism and non-Western sources. What is primitivism? Well, it's the search for simpler, more basic ways, a simpler, more basic way of life away from Western urban sophistication and social restrictions. So,
okay, I just wanted to say this is evidence of what I was talking about that was birthed during the Enlightenment era. This assumption that one perspective is more advanced or somehow more relevant to the top of a hierarchy than another one. And sophistication here is used as a word that sounds like it's something we want to approach, but it is a synonym for complication or technology or other different things like that. And this assumption that social restrictions are much more complicated in European life than they are in a town in Western Africa just demonstrates that kind of self-acknowledging perspective that was born out of that Enlightenment era. But so when we say primitivism, what we're talking about is non-European culture that is not based on the technologies of European society. It should not mean, and it should not be equal to the idea of less than. So I want everybody, do you guys understand that? These are the words that are associated with it. These are the words that are used. This is one of the things that's frustrating looking at art history, because you realize now that the words that everybody are using are not entirely appropriate, and they're not always really that gentle with the subjects. But as long as you guys know that, and sophistication is that same kind of irony, language irony there, but just on the other side. So anyway.
They're looking at primitive forms to replace the things that they already know. Now, what we're going to see is a stylization and distortion in Picasso's groundbreaking works, such as La Moselle d'Avignon, which we're going to look at later, painted in 1907. And these forms will come primarily from African art in the form of African masks. Now, how does he know about them? Well, Picasso more than likely first saw African art when in May or June of 1907, he visited the Ethnographic Museum in the Palais de Trocadero in Paris. Now, the thing that you need to understand is when he walked into that museum, he would have seen masks, well, very similar to the way you're seeing them here. No labels, no understanding of what they are. After all, the French are just sort of picking them up. They're going, I seem to have found a mask. I think it has meaning. I take it back. And they put it in the museum and they assign meaning to it. In fact,
this is one of the reasons why I like this guy, because it's probably exactly like what it was. The bronze heads that the Yoruba made 1,000 years before the Renaissance were found as a Nigerian prince was redoing the foundation for his new palace. And in 1930s, a British guy, businessman, found that and said, "Hey, I'll buy that off of you for $15," and took it back home with them, sold it to the British Museum for $35, who declared that it was only 200 years old. And it's, that's how we get a lot of this nonsense perpetuated. People just did not care to find out how old something actually was, where it actually came from. That's how these masks, somebody probably said, "Yeah, I'm going to keep your kids, but I'll give one of them back to you if you give me a mask." And so they got a mask for each of the kids and took them home and sold them for $15 a piece or something. That's the kind of, when cultures view themselves at the top of a hierarchy or at the bottom of a hierarchy, it really informs how they relate to other people. And I just think that's really kind of interesting.
They often leave it up to the viewer to assign meaning to. And so Picasso looks at them as depicting sort of a air of primitive innocence, as well as innocent sexuality and innocent energy, things that are related to some of his later paintings. Now, the Cubist painters also rejected the inherent concept that art should copy nature, or that artists should adopt the traditional techniques of perspective, modeling, and foreshortening. Instead, they wanted to emphasize the two-dimensionality of the canvas. So they reduced and fractured objects into geometric forms and then realigned them within a shallow relief-like space. Here you're seeing a study, for example, of a violin. So they're also using multiple or contrasting vantage points. Remember my example of the iPhone. That's exactly what they're doing. So you're looking at things from different directions at the same time. By the way, in doing so, they actually capture time, because you can't look at something from different directions at the same time. For example, your cell phone, it takes time, quite literally takes time, to turn it around so that you can see what's on the back. And so they're capturing time as well as capturing these different identifiable elements laid out in a different form on their canvas. So in Cubist work, up to 1910, the subject of a picture is usually fairly discernible. Here we know this is a guitar. Although figures and objects were dissected or analyzed into a multitude of small facets, these were then reassembled.
I think this three-dimensional collage is a really good example of the kind of thinking that we're talking about. So if we know that this is a guitar, we can see that this is one plane, this is one plane, and they're stacking them, they're separating them. We've got that sound box hole there. We've got the neck, and you can see all the elements are there, but they're distorted, they're changed. Like this part is a lot smaller than this part. And if it was on the same guitar, this, of course, would be bigger. And they're not exactly in the right places, but you can recognize each of those elements. And I think that's an important thing that he's talking about.
After a fashion, to evoke those same figures or objects. Though primarily associated with painting, Cubism also exerted a profound influence on the 20th century. In sculpture and architecture, we'll see Cubist design turning up in Futurism in all their forms. The liberating formal concepts initiated by Cubism also had far-reaching consequences for Dada and Surrealism, as well as for all artists pursuing abstraction in Germany, Holland, Italy, England, America, and Russia. So this is going to be an incredibly important movement, an incredibly important set of ideas, which is why I've spent so much time trying to explain what Cubism is.
Let's see. There we go. I wanted to share something else that kind of gives, I think, a really good idea about the time aspect. And as we look at some of these things, take this into account. You guys know who Edward Muybridge is, don't you? He's the guy that basically the fairy godfather of cinema. Because one day he was in a bar and he overheard a conversation. He was a photographer, and somebody made a bet that a horse's legs, one stayed on the ground all the time, even when it was galloping.
It was
otherwise,
Leland Stanford.
What's that?
Leland Stanford. He was the governor of California at the time.
Well, so Edward Muybridge thought, okay, I'm going to use my photo skills to prove this. I'm glad we have a name now of the guy that made the bet. So he started doing, and it is an extensive, amazing catalog, draped and undraped figures. A lot of his stuff informs movies still, as well as fashion illustration and lots of other stuff. But he set up all these very fast shuttered cameras, very fast exposure cameras in sequence, so that as a person moved, a camera would be photo would be taken, sometimes a tenth of a second apart or even less. And so you see these kinds of animals and critters. Now, why is this important? Imagine for a second if you want to express this kind of passage of time, but you don't have a movie to express it within. A lot of these artists started taking those kinds of snapshot images and laying them on top of each other. And if you think of that, how do you think this horse would look, or this person walking? I mean, it's going to look, you're going to have a principal body, and then you're going to have a skirt that flares out over here, and a skirt that flares out down here. You're going to have a head that's right down here, head right there, a head up here. You're going to have all these different things that looks really weird until you realize that they're showing the same figure as it passes through time. So do you guys kind of see how these things fit together into Cubism? It's not just people making something with the intention of other people getting really uncomfortable. And there's a lot of, I want you to go through and look at these artists that different artists approached Cubism in very different ways. And some of them are a lot more abstracted than others. But what is really interesting, I want to look at this piece in particular, this image right here by Albert Gleizes. This is Man in a Hammock. And we look at that, we can look at the different things going on. I want to enlarge this just a little bit. So some of the rationales behind this are just a validation of human life. That's one thing, that different people's perspectives are just fine. And we look at different things, like we can look through over the edge of the hammock through the window. We can see something that might very well be a cityscape. And what's interesting about this is the buildings are simplified to very simple geometric constructions, but it looks like the shadows vary from building to building. And one of the reasons are, if they're showing the passage of time all at the same time, then they're going to show facets of this outside view as it would appear standing in different areas of the room, as well as during different periods of the day. So that's true of that. And then you look at this, the hammock. The hammock is most likely not shaped exactly like this, but we get, if you can imagine the artist standing up and painting one line, sitting down and painting another line, going over to the right side of the room, looking back and painting portions of the figure, going to the left side of the room, painting portions of the figure. And, expressing, using that kind of permission that they gave themselves during Fauvism and Expressionism to use color to kind of emphasize the changing of these different perspectives. Maybe it looks like to me that this person sitting, at one point their arm was straight, another point their arm went up and held the edge of the hammock. It looks like the person was on their right ear and then at one point turned a little bit so that they're on the back of their head. It looks to me like at one point the arm was folded at the elbow with a hand along the thigh. And then here you see the hand holding a bottle draping over the edge of the hammock. Both feet were inside at one point, and now we also have a foot outside. You can look over here. There's different water levels in the water jug. So the person took a couple sips. The egg and the loaf are in different positions. Maybe they recorded it one point right before lunch, one point right after lunch. But is this making a little bit of sense now when we look at this? And I think one of the most beautiful things to me about this is that Cubism really demonstrates that the artists were expecting you as a viewer to participate with them in finishing off or developing the meaning of the work. Because they expected you to be smart enough to realize and work with them as they were showing different perspectives, as they were showing different viewpoints. And I think that's beautiful for a couple of reasons. Well, one of the main ones is that that's a direct communication of the idea that multiple perspectives are valid, both from an art point of view as well as a human point of view. And I just think that's amazing. So I used to be completely honest, Cubism used to make me want to vomit. But as I learn more about it and I can appreciate it more, now I think it's one of the first art movements where the artists were really kind of crying out to everybody that all of us have valid perspective. And I think that's pretty amazing. I like this one. One of my favorite, Sonia Delany, is a Cubist artist who, instead of painting objects moving through time, she would paint the colors of her emotions and her feelings in her relationship to objects as they move through time. And I think that that's just astounding. What an incredibly brilliant person to take that kind of view. And I just think it's amazing. So again, watch these. And I think that this, John G. Metzinger, I think this is a really brilliant still life, because you can see very much the artist was standing up right here, sitting down when they painted this side of the picture. Same kind of thing, standing up right here, sitting down right here. Right here, the water level is higher. Maybe it's a little bit earlier in the day. Here it's a little bit lower because they had a drink and they put the cup back maybe in a different place. Maybe this is the cup when it was on the table, and this is when the cup was taken off the table. But I think this is a beautiful example because it really kind of ties in with, imagining what a horse running would look like if you took all those individual shots and layered them on top of each other. Yeah, and Edward Maybridge, I think he was one of the ones that proposed a number of cells for a second of film then now the standard is 24. And that's, as an animator, that's what I had to, 24 different images of the figure. And digital animation now is so amazing because you don't have to pay that that kind of level of attention to it. But anyway, I just think it's really cool. And then we get Marcel Duchamp, he does some really fascinating things where he is demonstrating this awareness of geometry, demonstrating these elements of time and perspectives, but then he's also teasing out interesting forms from the geometry that he's developing as well. And Marcel Duchamp is kind of a smart aleck too. He's, I guess in today's terminology, he'd be a wise ass, but he would come up with titles that were sometimes intended to make you think, and sometimes intended just to irritate the hell out of the art critics. And so, he's just an amazing guy. There's a couple interviews from the 50s that are on YouTube now. This is definitely watch a couple of those. Very cool, very fun. So I have both men and women from France, Spain, and elsewhere that were all considered pioneers of Cubism. So definitely go through, look at the paintings, and definitely watch the videos. Okay. But I hope your nose has stopped bleeding after that dump from regarding phenomenology, but I think that that's really important. And Cubism is one of those things that really represents not the point of the shift away from an old perspective to a new perspective, but a realm of time when artists were really stating loudly that the perspective was shifting. I think the Favists tried doing that, but that continued and morphed into the Cubists, and the Cubists were doing it as loudly as they could. I think it's amazing where with the Cubists we can really see that the artists are inviting us and expecting us to be smart enough to get what they're doing, which is so cool, because we have this kind of idea that a real artist doesn't explain their work because if you don't get it, you're just too dumb. So why would they bother wasting their time? And that is completely not true at all. A good artist is always happy to talk about what they do. The best artists are always thrilled. There are a couple artists that I really like. They are religious artists, and I remember one of them we were at. I don't remember what the show was. Like one of the LDS Church International exhibits or something like that. And I walked up to him and said, "Oh, I really love your painting." And he turned around. You could see that mask go on where, oh no, it's another person I have to talk to. And I said, "You're one of the very few Jesus painters that doesn't make me vomit." And that just changed it. We're still friends. But it's so much fun to see artists that when you are brave enough to talk to an artist about their work, they love visiting about it. And I think that the Cubists are even though it's very one-sided because we don't get to talk to them, it still seems to me that they're really excited for people to engage with their work and try to get it, because they expect us to be smart. They expect us to be intelligent enough to understand what they're doing. And I think that there's enough clues there to help us. So the things that go into it are the geometry from African masks, shifting technologies in both physical transportation and communication, multiple perspectives in like blueprints and things like that, multiple perspectives through time, and the validity of all human experience, and accepting that other people thinking differently are just as valid as you. That is an outgrowth of phenomenology applied to social structures. So does that make sense to you guys? Okay. I hope nobody passed out. And the people watching at home after we record this, if you do pass out, just go back to where you passed out and watch the rest of it after you're good and awake.
I just had a quick question.
That's weird because I was just opening my mouth to say, does anybody have any questions?
I do. Have you read the play Picasso at the La Panagile?
No.
It's one of my favorite plays. I've directed it many times. I just directed it 2 summers ago here, but it's Einstein and Picasso, and they meet in a bar, And Einstein is talking about figuring out his theory of relativity, and Picasso's right at the end when he's about to see Demoiselle d'Avignon. And it's I get it more. And I have read this play like 1,000 times. But there's a moment where Einstein is screaming at Picasso and he's trying to poke a pencil through a piece of paper. And he's like, "You don't get it. I'm fracturing time." And he's like screaming at him. And I'm like, oh my God, there it is. Temporal. Got it. I'll find the scene. You guys have to, it's hilarious.
What I think is so funny is that sometimes with hindsight, we can see what these guys are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started learning sign language, a friend of mine who was blind said, "What's the point?" And so we had this shtick where I would sign to him, and he would say, "I don't get it. Do it louder." and but I could just see that kind of frustration sometimes.
Yeah.
And it got so bad that in Picasso's later life, he just gave up. He didn't want to
Yeah.
talk to anybody, and he said, "I'm nothing more than a capering clown." And it is really sad, but at that time, it was revolutionary. And it's revolutionary because it didn't give permission to everybody. It recognized the permission that everybody has already to be valid. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you very much. I'm glad you mostly stayed awake. Mostly. But I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Any last questions? All right, awesome. Thank you so much for being with me today, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Great. Thanks, guys.